And so my name is Nick Brewer. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the Artistic Programming Director of the League of Canadian Poets. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for our Freedom to Read Week event. We're very, very excited to have Farzana Doctor and Gary Geddes here. They are both previous winners of the Writers Union of Canada's Freedom to Read Award. The latest winner was actually announced today, and that was author and journalist Brandy Morin. We are huge fans of TWUC's Freedom to Read Award. It's a very important part of what writers do and what the union does. So we're really excited to have Farzana and Gary here with us tonight. I have just a few boring words before we get going to the interesting part of the evening. I'm going to share what the League of Canadian Poets does with you, although I do believe all of us here are probably familiar. But our mandate is to elevate the cultural significance of poetry and to champion the role of poets. We work to nurture and expand poetry communities and audiences. And the organization cultivates the local, national, and international publication, performance, and recognition of poetry. We support equitable and inclusive artistic practice through poetry education and development. I also would like to acknowledge that the office of the League is situated in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I personally am coming to you from Kitchener, which is located on the Haldimand Tract, and this is traditional territories of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And the Six Nations are actually in active litigation against both Canada and Ontario over land claims disputing the 95% of land of the Haldimand Tract that was lost since it was given to the Six Nations in the 1870s. You can find out more about what Six Nations is doing at sixnations.ca. And we also want to recognize the historical and ongoing colonial significance of our organization name, the League of Canadian Poets. And we acknowledge that not all members of our community identify with the term Canadian, and we support these members and their right to self-identify while still having access to the programs and services we offer. And a big thank you to the Canada Council of the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. They provide us with operating funding each year that allows us to put on free events like this and to support our members and the poetry community in Canada. We're very, very grateful to their support and truly couldn't do what we do without it. And finally, Freedom to Read Week is an annual event that encourages Canadians to think about and reaffirm their commitment to intellectual freedom. As of 2024, Freedom to Read Week entered a new phase led by Library and Archives Canada, the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, and the Ontario Library Association in partnership with the Book and Periodical Council. You can find out more at freedomtoread.ca. I'm almost done talking because now I'm going to introduce our wonderful poets for the evening, but that means I'm reading their bios to you first. So just a few more words from me before we get to hear some beautiful poetry. Farzana will be our first reader. Farzana Doctor is the Toronto-based author of 4 novels, Feeling Nazarene, 6 Meters of Pavement, All Inclusive, and 7. Her poetry collection, You Still Look the Same, which Quill and Clier has called a powerful and necessary collection that breaks silences, was released in May 2022. In about a week or so, but she sent me this bio, I think more than a week ago, so this might be happening like now. Her new self and community care workbook for helpers and activists, 52 Weeks to a Sweeter Life, will hit bookstore shelves. Has it hit them?
I just heard from one in Toronto that they got their copies, and I got my copy yesterday.
Amazing. So it's in the world. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to the League for inviting me here today. It's quite an honor. So I'm going to be reading from my book of poetry, You Still Look the Same. This is a book of poems that I had mostly written in my 40s, and I'm in my early 50s now. And it was quite a decade that involved a lot of topsy-turvy. So I'm going to just read a few poems from here. And just keeping with tonight's event, all of my poems are either directly or indirectly political in some way, and I will read you kind of a selection of it. Some a little bit more serious, or and some kind of more uplifting. Try to give you a good spread of it. So each section of this collection starts with a haiku. And I always tell people that because people are not always aware that that's what's happening. There's a title page with a tongue-in-cheek therapy question followed by a haiku. So this is the first one. 1, therapy homework. Describe the world ending in as few words as possible. One day we left home, forgot to lock the front door. Terrible mistake. And I'm going to read from, this is called Just Fine. Oh no, I'm not reading that one, sorry. This is called Judging Other People's Breakups. Some of you will relate to this. Judging other people's breakups. He wanted to bring a bouquet like he did the last 4 times you launched a book. Knows you adore lilies. But he's no longer the one seated beside you, clasping your damp hand, your beaded clutch on his lap. Now at back of room, he claps, laughs, heartburn rising. Maybe he shouldn't have come. He's bought this new novel dedicated to your fresh love. Isn't sure whether to queue for an inscription. In his dim bedroom, he'll read your lines twice over, hoping to find himself inside them. Okay, this is another one of the therapy questions and a haiku. 2, therapy homework. Describe the process of middle age self-searching in as few words as possible. 1 airline ticket, 2 years of online dating. But what did you find? And this is I think nearly everyone I know who has ever online dated has written a poem about online dating. So here's mine. You can't help it, right? Like, there's just so much to process and say about online dating. This is called Swipe Left. The research question: what's it like to be a straight girl looking for love? My design may be flawed, but after many dates, countless online interactions to understand your customs, I've reached an interim hypothesis. Your men are a problem. Perhaps that's not accurate. I have no control group and my subjectivity is the consistent dependent variable. My data suggests direct communication is not a norm. There is much baby, baby, smile for me, and jokes that go one beat too far. I don't profess expertise in linguistics. A colleague suggests my sample is skewed, that there are precisely 21 straight cis dudes ruining dating apps for everyone. I don't disagree with that theory, but doubt its accuracy. It's easy to recruit subjects. An ounce of ethanol, a single survey question, they'll follow you home. I stand by my method of observer immersion. An interesting finding, they think they are taking you to bed even when it's your key turning the lock. My funding allows me to employ my dog, secondary researcher, to assess subjects at door. I document carefully the length and quality of each sniffing episode and whether she rolls her eyes or sits for a treat. A confounding variable. Once and only once did she snarl at a tall white man who wore a fedora and smelled of desperation. I dropped him from my study. Quixotic reliability. Each and every time I introduce queer theory into the interview, the subjects reveal one identical porn fantasy. The most significant part of the experiment is not the most pleasurable and vice versa. I'm not always certain how to co-pillow talk Qualitative data tumbles from lips, leaves stains on my pillowcases, outlines lingering for weeks. I've recorded 31% tenderness, combined with 66% white supremacy and 72% mansplaining. At the end of the project, I will deactivate my account, ghost my participants, won't present any findings. Yes. Okay, here's a more politicized one, political one. This one is called Universal Apathy, and it was very much inspired by one of my visits to Lebanon, which is experiencing a lot of tragic outcomes these days. We're well aware of what's happening in Gaza, but also Lebanon, and particularly South Lebanon, has been bombed by Israel for all of these months. And I think very much about folks who are there right now. And this poem is dedicated to one of my friends there. Universal Apathy for Fatme. Learning Arabic, I get stuck at Ain, frustrated by a consonant that looks like a number, sounds like a vowel. I fear I will never get it right. Wiki Travel's colonial explanation. To say this letter, use the throat muscles, just like when you are throwing up. I practice with an everyday phrase. Shu badnanamal. What you gonna do? I cough it out to evoke sympathy, to be funny, show off, fit in. But it's during Trump's first February, I finally comprehend its mix of universal apathy and Lebanese Zen. I hear it echo everywhere, words fluttering up from a million windpipes, white seagulls circling Lebanon's turbulent seas. Later, with Fatme, we discuss laws that allow rapists to marry victims instead of jail. And before I can stop them, the words are up my esophagus, spewing from mouth, so well traveled they no longer require effort. Shubadnanamo. Her eyes spark anger, mouth wide open, tongue depressed, uvula exposed to emit a thundercloud. Lazem namal shi. We must do something. My throat dry, empty. Lazem namal shi? How have I never heard this expression before? Lazem namal shi? Why did I not seek this translation? I store this phrase in my gullet, ready myself for spring. And I'm going to just read these last two. And so one of my activist endeavors is to work against the practice of FGM, or female genital cutting. And in the community that I'm from, it happens, and it's called Katna. And so I wrote a few poems that address activism around that in this book. And I think there's only a couple words you need to know. So first of all, Sayedna. Sayedna is the big holy religious leader of our community. And I'm also going to talk about miti sitabi. And miti sitabi is a special occasion meal that's normally reserved for women's milestones. And it starts with a prayer and continues with a 10-course meal. Okay. So this poem is called Grandmothers. In your granddaughter's whispers, maybe in her dreams, to social workers in courtrooms, inshallah, in verse, you will be named. You will be named for glorifying bearded men who never recognized your glory, for not questioning, for not knowing the questions. I get it. You wanted her to be Nike. Nike means clean. I get it. You wanted her to be Nike because you felt dirty for inheriting violence, passing it down. I'm sorry, but you will be named. Even if she doesn't recall the afternoon of promised candy, her body will remember you will be named. You'll never go back to when she buried her face in your lap. Rida and belly fat, her pillow, no. After, didn't she flinch at your touch? This is naming too. Do not fool yourself. She may never speak a bad word, may defend you to your blessed grave, but you will be named. You will be named by me, by she, by us. We will speak into silence until there is a cacophony of voices shouting Sayedna's name. And this is the next poem in the suite, and it's a bit more aspirational. It's what I hope will happen one day. An imagined Miti Sitabi for 7-year-olds. 1. Gather the youngsters, not just girls, but boys too, and the kids who teach us the breadth and splendor of gender. First, the lesson, spin a globe, remind them who they are. Children of Gujarat, before that Yemen, today settlers on other lands. Share stories of Allah, make eyes glow, harvest moons on clearest nights, invite them to believe, or not. There will be no talk about allegiances to rogues who make empty promises. Instead, speak of ties to cousins, great-great-grandmothers, smog-damaged trees, elephants, and bumblebees. Suggest they close eyes, sense whispers from within, pulses beneath skin. Instruct them to serve kindness, to prepare extra plates for unexpected guests. Make them remember we are a learned people. Urge them to read Lord and Rumi, turn ears to Ila Arun and Isque, paint fingernails and landscapes, voice 100 impossible to answer questions. Confess our blunders, how we spurned siblings, defaced our women, set ablaze neighbors' homes, accepted false gods, worshipped gold, believed we were the chosen ones. Ask them to be better, to be gracious, to be merciful. 2. Next, the Jaman. Seat them 7 to a towel, pour water from silver chalamchi lotas over small outstretched hands. The first course, a pinch of salt. Obeisance to hadith that insisted white crystals could save us from 70 diseases, leprosy, madness, ourselves. Tell the children we now understand this was a lie fabricated by men, God knows why. Bring the rest of the food, all a nod to the sweetness of life, tablespoon of kulfi, sliver of cake, circle of jalebi, jube, cube of burfi, slice of mango, pista mitai, gummy bear, and finally another pinch of salt to test the tongue. A second hand washing. Distribute certificates, proof of attendance, colored outside the lines, decorated with stickers, felt, and glitter. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farzana. Thank you for that reading. I had the privilege of seeing Farzana read in last summer at a festival that we were both part of, and I just love the way you read. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm just gonna link in the chat to it's a thing called Book Manager, and it shows you what indie bookstores near you have You Still Look the Same, Farzana's book of poetry. It's just kind of available wherever books are sold, but I love the Book Manager link.
There's also an audiobook. I like to tell everyone about the audiobook because so many of us are a little fatigued from reading, and listening can be a nice thing with poetry, I find. So,
Very cool. I will also, I'll share the link directly to Farzana's website as well, in case anyone wants that. Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Now I am going to introduce Gary. So first up, you'll have to sit through me reading your bio. and so does everyone else. Gary Geddes has written and edited more than 50 books of poetry, fiction, drama, nonfiction, criticism, translation, and anthologies, and won a dozen national and international literary awards, including the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, America's Region, the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence, and the Gabriela Mistral Prize from the Government of Chile. His most recent poetry books are The Resumption of Play, The Ventriloquist, and The Oysters I Bring to Banquets. Geddes has taught at Concordia, Western Washington University, and University of Missouri St. Louis, and served as writer-in-residence at U of Alberta, Green College, Ottawa U, and the Vancouver Public Library. And I realized I copied another sentence twice, so I don't need to read the last sentence. And so I will introduce Gary. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's such a pleasure to be here and share some thoughts and poems with Farzana and the folks that have managed to find us online. Jean-Paul Sartre once remarked that writing and reading are intimately linked with the ideals of democracy. One of the most important of those ideals, he said, being the freedom of expression. I share that belief. I also connect with his description of the intimate relationship between readers and writers, which involves the writer offering the gift of imagination and the reader offering the gift of attention. I believe poetry is a call to action and at its best also a source of healing. It speaks to the wound in each of us, the part that's broken and so often in ruins. How does it do that? Well, there are many ways, but the one I prefer was best expressed by John Berger, the British art critic who retired to a farm in France to think and to write. He said, "Poetry makes language care because it renders everything intimate. There's nothing more substantial to place against the cruelty and indifference of the world than this caring." I'd like to start with a poem some of you know all too well, which I think is a gift, as an example of the kind of intimate detail that Berger celebrates. It's about Sandra Lee Scheuer, a student shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University on May 4, 1970. The unarmed students were protesting the escalation of the Vietnam War into Cambodia when the soldiers fired 211 rounds of assault weapon ammunition into the crowd, killing 4, wounding 9 others. After years of trying to write about this tragic event, some information about Sandra Lee came to my attention, which enabled me to discard all my angry and unpublishable diatribes against American foreign policy and write this simple elegy. 4 details. She was a speech therapy student. She was very tidy. She loved to roller skate, and she was not especially political. You might have met her on a Saturday night, cutting precise circles clockwise at the Moonglow roller rink, or walking with quick step between the campus and a green 2-story house, where the room was always tidy, the bed made, the books in confraternity on the shelves. She did not throw stones, major in philosophy, or set fire to buildings, though acquaintances say she hated war, had heard of Cambodia. In truth, she wore a makeup of a brassiere and could no doubt more easily have married a guardsman than cursed or put a flower in his rifle barrel. While the armories burned, she studied, bent low over notes, speech therapy books, pages open at sections on impairment, physiology. And while they milled and shouted on the commons, she helped a boy named Billy with his lisp, saying, "Hiss, Billy, like a snake. That's it. Sss. Tongue well up and back behind your teeth. Now buzz, Billy, like a bee. Feel the air vibrating in my windpipe as I breathe." As she walked in sunlight through the parking lot at noon, feeling the world a passing lovely place, a young guardsman who had his sights on her, was going down on one knee, as if he might propose. His declaration, unmistakable, articulate, flowered within her, passed through her neck, severed her trachea, taking her breath away. Now who will burn the midnight oil for Billy, ensure the perilous freedom of his speech? And who will see her skating at the Moonglow roller rink, the 8 small wooden wheels making their countless revolutions on the floor? The second poem is about the killing of union organizers by employees of the Coca-Cola Company in Guatemala, based on information provided to me by the Catholic Worker newspaper. Time out for Coca-Cola. Marlon Mendizabal turns on the TV after a hard day of bargaining. Children play at his feet, a football match in progress on the American Channel. All morning, he has met with officials at the Coca-Cola plant trying to resolve the strike. The company has hired 3 new Army officers to direct warehousing, personnel, security. 6 eyes want him gone. 6 new laser eyes negotiate his disappearance piece by piece. First, his voice, venturing out passionately, logically, vanishes as nothing he says makes the least impression. Then his hands, picking up the argument, running interference for his voice, falter, are brought down short of the goal. Soon the only arms he has to surrender are gone too. He leans back, an invisible man, a desaparecido, but the family hasn't noticed. Nothing done or said could make him lose face, but that went too, along with the rest. He's not alone. 27 union leaders from the National Confederation of Labor have been kidnapped. 2 months later, another 17 murders confirmed by the Conference of Guatemala Bishops. Marlon wants to live for the sake of his kids, but it's too late. Of the 208 bones in his body, half have returned to the packing crates. His abdomen shrinks from its diet of fear. His children watch the soft drink commercial on television, cheering on the Coke truck as it falls behind that of its rival. He wants to tell them it's a matter of ethics, not taste, that the truck contains the bones of 100,000 murdered Guatemalans, killed by death squads in the pay of government and large corporations. Instead, he lays an invisible hand on their heads and offers up a silent prayer for their safety. Marlon's heart grows so large it fills the room until even those on television notice and stop what they're doing to watch and listen to the message of that heart as it communes with God. Football players take off helmets and stand with heads bowed. The announcers for once are at a loss for words. Outside Dallas, the Coke truck pulls over, lights flashing, a door opens, and those bones form a vast bridge that stretches all the way to Guatemala City. Children are crossing, hands joined, singing. Nothing can stop them. The third piece, and I apologize for the heaviness of all of these pieces, but so much of my lifetime has been spent trying to deal with these things that deeply trouble me. This one is about the military coup and dictatorship in Chile, where I was doing human rights interviews, first with families of the disappeared, then with Jaime Hallas, editor of Analysis magazine. Behind him on the wall was a large photograph of his foreign affairs editor, who'd been murdered a few days earlier by Pinochet's thugs. When I asked Jaime about censorship in Chile, he paused, stroked his beard, then said, "Here, your books and words may survive, but you may not." Human Rights Commission. The small woman seated before you describes her encounters with the military. In advance of the translation, you hear the phrase, caravan of death. She's not talking about a circus. Her husband has not run away to a circus, though there was one in town the day you arrived, the real McCoy. Medieval etchings of the dance of death flicker in a dark recess of your brain. Do you really want to hear this? Yesterday you were curious, took notes copiously, numbers, implements of torture, the general who traveled the provinces with his exterminators, and a chihuahua that sat on the back of the car seat, licking his ear. October 23, 1973, the end of so much. 5 months later, she too is arrested, kept naked 20 days, a sack over her head. Kicks, blows, electricity, threats against the children. Pretense her husband is still alive. You look again at this woman and wonder how much she is not telling you. A heated pipe, a rat driven into the vagina through a heated pipe. When the interview began, the portable radio was playing Moon Shadow by Cat Stevens. A poster on the wall said in Spanish, "No one disappears into thin air." The last two poems I'll share with you tonight are about current and not so current moments in Palestine and Israel relations. I was in West Bank, Israel, and Gaza 20 years ago in 1994, shortly after the signing of the Oslo Accords, when there was still hope for peace and a two-nation solution among Palestinians and also among left-leaning Israelis, the same engaged and enlightened individuals, 400,000 of whom hit the streets to protest their government's bombing of Sabra and Shatila, and most recently to protest Netanyahu's efforts to neuter the Supreme Court. I was doing readings then, this time with my dear friend and poet, the late John Asfour. And what troubled us most was the evidence of Israeli Defense Forces destroying the houses of any Palestinian family who had a member caught throwing stones or speaking out against apartheid conditions. What does a house want? A house has no unreasonable expectations of travel or imperialist ambitions. A house wants to stay where it is. A house does not demonstrate against partition or harbor grievances. A house is a safe haven, anchorage, place of rest. Shut the door on excuses, on greed, political expediency. A house remembers its original inhabitants, ventures comparisons. The woman tossing her hair on a doorstep. The man bent over his tools and patch of garden. What does a house want? Laughter, sounds of lovemaking to strengthen the walls. A house wants people, a permit to persevere. A house has no stones to spare. No house has ever been convicted of a felony unless privacy be considered a crime in the new dispensation. What does a house want? Firm joints, things on the level, water rising in pipes. Put out the eyes, forbid the drama of exits, entrances. Somewhere in the rubble, a mechanism leaks time. No place familiar for a fly to land on. Now, the final poem was written in response to a photograph that came to me over the internet. 3 young girls pulled from the bombed building in Gaza. The image troubled me so much I couldn't find no peace until I enlarged the image, studied it closely, and noticed the intimate details that were waiting to be discovered. And if Nick can pull this up, it would be great to have it on the screen while I'm reading this.
Absolutely. I'm going to share the image now and just want to let you know that it is a graphic image. And so if you'd like to look away, then do so.
now I've lost my I lost my little screen, but here I'll get the poem from my sheets here and read it off the sheets. Sorry for the delay here. Okay, can we come? You've got the large image. I'll just start with the poem. It's called Endgame with Acronyms. The prison that was Gaza is now a charnel house. In the latest online photo, 3 young girls, not yet 10, rescued from rubble. One with an angry bruise on her cheek, blood on her upper lip, and beneath her right eye. The saddest bewildered face, but on her smudged pale green t-shirt, the whimsical outline of a rabbit, and above its droopy ear, 4 uppercase English letters spell H-O-P-E. Seated beside her, face and neck bloodied, hair and top knot white with dust from the explosion, head turned from the camera, is a child in a black t-shirt, and inside its red heart symbol, the acronym BFF, Best Friends Forever. I refuse to call this collateral damage, a euphemism which casts no blame. The final member of this trinity of innocence, petite, her hair disheveled, eyes wild, mouth gaping, oblivious to the moment, recalls scenes witnessed before arriving in the hospital, not quite believing what she sees, and for which no words or poetic niceties suffice. Thank you for sharing those with me.
Thank you, Gary. I also, I did share the image in the chat as well, if anyone would like to refer to the image again. Thank you for that reading, Gary. Very appreciate you being here and sharing that essential poetry, as someone said in the chat. I also found a link to the first poem that Gary read this evening, and so you can find that in the chat if you would like to revisit it. And I'm going to go ahead and add Farzana to this spotlight as we begin a discussion on poetry and freedom of expression. And if anyone would like to add questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. Questions for Gary and Farzana. And I'm going to start with a question that Gary actually sent me ahead of the reading, which I think is an excellent first question. There is a line in W.H. Auden Elegy for W.B. Yeats in which the speaker of the poem says, "Poetry makes nothing happen." This has often been used to argue that poetry and politics are strange bedfellows. Do you feel that the phrase political poetry is a contradiction in terms? I feel the short answer is no, of course not. Gary, I'll let you go ahead and start with an answer, and then Farzana, if you could also chime in, I'd love that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting line for me to think about, because when I was young and writing this political work and was praised for this by George Woodcock, a lot of people took exception to it and basically told me that poetry and politics don't belong together. And they often quoted this line, "Poetry makes nothing happen," but they never bothered thinking about it or looking at the rest of Auden's writing. And the important line, I think, in his essays is this one: the mere making of a work of art is a political act. No matter how mediocre it is, it reminds the management that we're humans, not machines. And a couple of comments by other writers. Robert Hass, he said, "Because rhythm has direct access to the unconscious, because it can enter our bodies and make us move, it has power, and power is political." His second comment on the subject is, the job of poetry, its political job, is to refresh the idea of justice, which is going dead in us all the time. My favorite comment about whether the phrase poetry, political poetry, is a contradiction in terms comes from James Scully, an American poet, in a book called Line Break: Poetry as Social Practice, where he writes, political poetry is not a contradiction in terms, but an instructive redundancy. It does not hold a mirror up to nature. It holds social reality up to the sheep, showing poetry its own face, its conditions, its grounds and horizons, showing finally that there is no poetry that is not political, that the phrases apolitical and political both have a political project or agenda. One dreams transcendence, denial, immobility, whereas the other admits and treasures its problematical, restive, historical situation. That's too much from me, but mostly from other folks.
That's lovely. You know, the one thing that came to mind about this question is poetry and literature for me has been so political. It's been what has taught me so much about the world and has built my empathy and deepened my understandings. And just even sitting here tonight and listening to your poems, Gary, like there's a way that poetry is able to move us and maybe think more deeply and remember why we are humans. And a couple of days ago on Tuesday, I was at another story bookstore, and Publishers for Palestine put out a chapbook of poetry by Palestinian poets. And in this event, people were asked to come up and read. There were about 8 poems in the chapbook, and people were asked to come up and read. And when I came up to read, I asked everyone to read along with me. And there was such movement in the room. There was such solidarity. There was so much togetherness in the room. And this led to a conversation about what else can we do now? What are the organizations to get involved with? What further actions can happen? So I think that there is a way that all of this can move us into just wanting to be more human, wanting to do more, and maybe to be more political.
If I could,
Absolutely.
if
Oh,
I could
sorry.
ask a question here, or do you guys want to talk
Bruce.
first?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, it took me a second to realize who was talking. Bruce, go ahead.
I just had 2 comments. One, not too long ago, I was listening to an Indigenous poet from Edmonton, who his writing itself was quite beautiful, and it wasn't, you know, there's what's sometimes called writing from trauma, but I asked him about that and how he got there and how he felt it all fit into what he was doing. And one of the things he said was that beauty is a form of resistance because it's not expected of the likes of us. And the other thing that's influenced my thinking about this whole subject is there's an essay by Elaine Scarry, an American writer, and she said I think it's called On Beauty and Being Just. And what she says is that beauty doesn't guarantee justice, but it kind of prepares the ground, or it speaks to something else that belongs in that same space. I just sort of want to throw that out there, and you could respond if you like.
I'm pleased you mentioned that, Bruce. It's pretty important to make that link between beauty and justice. I'm glad that you shared that. It reminds me of a comment by Denise Levertov, where she makes the point that it's not just subject matter that makes poetry political. It's the care you take with the language. Here's the little quotation in which she explains that. It is the poet who has language in his care, the poet who more than others recognizes language as a form of life and a common resource to be cherished and served, as we should serve and cherish the earth, its waters, animal and vegetable life, and each other. The would-be poet who looks on language merely as something to be used, as the bad farmer or rapacious industrialist looks on the soil or on the rivers merely as things to be used, will not discover a deep poetry. He will only, according to the degree of his skill, construct a counterfeit or less acceptable, a sub-poetry, at best efficiently representative of his thought or feeling, a reference, but not an incarnation. And he will be contributing, even if not in any immediately apparent way, to the erosion of language, just as the irresponsible, irreverent farmer and industrialist erode the land and pollute the waters.
Thank
Yes,
you.
beauty and justice.
Farzana, would you like to respond?
You know, I'm actually thinking about the next question Gary was going to put forward, because I think what you've just said connects in with that. Do you want to go to that next question?
Yeah, I'll share that question and then let you keep going. It's, how do you keep an engaged poem from turning into a partisan diatribe or a piece of propaganda?
Yeah. So it makes me think about the question of the language and how we use language, how we use craft. But you know, a piece of propaganda can be poetry and vice versa too, right? So, I've given this a lot of thought, because I've given more thought to it probably with my novels, because I have more of those. And early on, I think with my first novel, one of the critics who was reviewing the book said that there were times when it ended up being a political diatribe. It sounded like I was on a soapbox about whatever issue it was that I was talking about. And I only, partly took that in because, reviews are highly subjective, but it did make me think about, like, how is it that we can reach people in a way that perhaps gets the message in a sideways kind of way, for those who sometimes need the message to come in a sideways way, because we want to be effective, right, with our work. And so, even with the poems, for example, the FGMC poems in this poetry collection, and in my last novel, it's a novel that takes up the issue in a very direct kind of way. I knew, like, this could make readers squirrely, right? It could turn people away. It could make people not be able to approach it. So how do you write about it both directly and in a sideways kind of way? That being said, Gary's, your last poem, where you had us look at the photograph, and when Nick, you were doing the little preamble before you put the photograph on, I thought, oh, well, I need to look away, because certainly we've all seen so many images that have been so difficult to look at. But the poem made me look more. I opened it up in the chat, and I expanded it on my screen after you started reading, Gary, and it made me feel like I didn't have to be so scared to look at this thing in a direct way, because of the language that you were using to describe the t-shirts and so on. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I was thinking about.
Well, I think I probably jumped the gun by giving the Denise Levertov quotation before the question was answered. So I'll mention that. But W.B. Yeats interestingly once said that he made a distinction between poetry and rhetoric, which I don't really make a distinction between. He said, with my argument with the world, I use rhetoric. My argument with myself, I use poetry. I think you said that things can go both ways, that a poem can in fact be propaganda. I suppose I would put it a little differently. I would say poetry is a persuasive form, like all other forms of writing. And if you want to make a point, you try to find the subtlest and most decent way to do it, not by preaching and shouting, but by finding what Berger calls those intimate details, and trying to look at both sides of the question. I have to mention this because that poem, the Gaza poem with the three girls, ended in the early draft, it ended with the line, "The safety of these girls depends on where the Führer's index finger points." And it was such a powerful image, I could hardly let go of it. But then I got thinking about it and thought, that is an unfair comparison. As terrible as Gaza is, it is not as terrible and premeditated as the Holocaust. And so I removed that. I thought it was a cheap shot. And I thought it also distracted from the three girls, which I was trying to make the point about their suffering. The point of the poem wasn't to see who to blame. It was really to make people face to face with that particular suffering. So I removed those lines. I'm glad I did.
Lovely.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to hit the leave button here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.